The noon sun beat down on the red oak basin with the weight of an anvil fresh from the forge, turning the air into shimmering veils of heat that made distance impossible to judge. The land stretched flat and red for miles, broken only by scattered formations of hoodoo rocks that rose like the bones of ancient giants. No shade offered itself. No mercy lived in this country. Just endless expanse and the thunder of hoofbeats closing in like the sound of fate itself. Hazel Whitcomb ran across that merciless terrain with her twin sister Sarah beside her, their buckskin dresses torn and knotted high at the thighs to free their legs, their boots pounding the baked earth in desperate rhythm. Sweat had plastered their blonde hair dark against their skulls, and dust caked their faces until they looked like creatures made of clay. Between them bounded a scrawny milk goat with wild yellow eyes, bleeding in sharp bursts that punctuated the thunder behind them. 3 riders bore down fast, their horses lathered white with foam. The lead man rose in his stirrups, steadied a Winchester rifle against his shoulder with practiced ease, and fired. The crack split the superheated air. The bullet whined past Hazel's head, close enough that she felt the displaced air kiss her cheek like a lover's warning. Her heart lurched into her throat. They were not going to make it. The rocks ahead were still 200 yards distant. The horses were eating up ground too fast. "Keep running," she gasped to Sarah, whose breath came in ragged sobs that spoke of lungs pushed past their limit. Another shot rang out, kicking up a geyser of dust at Hazel's feet. She stumbled but caught herself, her hand shooting out to grip Sarah's elbow and keep them both upright. Then from the north, another rider appeared like something conjured from necessity and desperation. He came at a full gallop, his bay horse running flat out with foam flying from its mouth in white streamers. The rider sat low in the saddle, his long black hair streaming behind him like a war banner, eagle feathers woven into the strands catching the sunlight. Fringed buckskin covered his chest and shoulders, and where his left hand should have been an iron hook, gleamed dully in the brutal sun. Lakota, a warrior by the look of him, by the way. He rode as though horse and man were a single creature. Hazel's stomach clenched with a new species of fear. But the warrior was not riding toward them. He was riding to intercept their pursuers, angling his mount between the sisters and the men who hunted them. "Get down!" he shouted, his voice carrying clear and commanding across the flats, pitched to cut through panic. Hazel did not waste breath on questions. She grabbed Sarah's arm and threw them both behind a low pile of sandstone boulders, just as another Winchester cracked. The bullet sparked off the rock 6 inches from her shoulder, sending stone fragments into her hair like hot needles. Sarah screamed a short, sharp sound, quickly bitten off, and curled into a ball hands over her head. The goat pressed itself against their legs, trembling violently, but mercifully silent now, as if it understood the stakes. The warrior hit the ground, in a controlled fall before his horse had fully stopped, boots skidding in the loose dust. He moved with the fluid economy of someone who had spent years in combat, every motion purposeful and efficient. His carbine, a battered Springfield with a leather loop tied ingeniously to the stock, was already in his hands. He drove the iron hook that replaced his left hand deep into a crack in the boulder, using it as an anchor point to steady the heavy rifle. Sweat darkened the fringes on his shirt and ran in rivulets down his neck, cutting trails through the dust. His breathing was controlled, measured despite the hard gallop. "Stay down," he said again, quieter this time, his voice a low rumble. His eyes never left the 3 riders who had reined up about 60 yards out, circling like wolves testing a wounded deer. Hazel pressed her back against the sun-heated rock, her heart hammering so hard she thought her ribs might crack. Beside her, Sarah was crying silently, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust and grime on her face. The goat butted Hazel's leg insistently, ears flat, refusing to bolt, despite every instinct screaming at it to run. "We are keeping the goat," Hazel said, and was startled to hear the edge of dark humor in her own voice. Terror did strange things to people, made them reach for anything familiar, anything human. The warrior glanced at her, then just a brief flicker of his dark eyes, nearly black in the shadow of his brow, and something passed between them. Recognition of shared desperation, acknowledgement of stubbornness in the face of death. Then it stays silent. He said, his voice carrying an undertone of grim amusement, "Or we all die here in this dust." The rustlers opened fire. 3 Winchesters cracking in rapid overlapping bursts that turned the world into thunder and chaos. Bullets hammered the rocks with sharp metallic whines, throwing up plumes of dust and stone fragments. One round ricocheted off the boulder inches from Hazel's face, and she felt the hot sting of rock splinters against her cheek, tasted the copper of blood on her tongue. The goat pressed itself lower somehow, understanding the geometry of death. Hazel reached out without thinking and placed her gloved hand on the warrior's wrist just above the leather straps that secured his hook to the stump of his forearm. His skin was hot and slick with sweat. She felt the tremor in his muscles, not fear, but the immense strain of holding the heavy carbine steady with only one hand and a crude iron prosthetic. "Steady," she whispered, though she did not know if she was reassuring him or herself, or simply speaking to hold on to her humanity in the middle of violence. He did not shake her off. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly, angling his body to shield both sisters more completely, making himself the primary target. Then he fired. The Springfield's report was deafening at close range, a physical force that slammed into her chest. One of the rustlers jerked violently in his saddle, his hat flying off a spray of red mist in the air behind him. He did not fall, but he wheeled his horse around with a curse that carried across the distance. The warrior worked the breech with practiced efficiency, his hook catching the lever and pulling it down and forward in a smooth motion that spoke of countless repetitions. The spent brass casing flew out glinting gold in the sunlight, and he slid another cartridge home from the bandolier across his chest. He fired again. A horse screamed a terrible, almost human sound of agony, and reared, throwing its rider hard into a clump of sagebrush, where he lay still. "Fall back," one of the rustlers yelled, his voice carrying over the ringing in Hazel's ears. They turned and spurred their horses, vanishing back into the heat shimmer like ghosts dissolving. But Hazel knew they would not go far. Men like that never did. They were professionals, patient and methodical. They would circle around, regroup, wait for darkness or a better angle, or simple exhaustion to tip the scales. For a long moment, the only sounds were the wind scraping across the rocks and the harsh rasp of their breathing. The warrior lowered the rifle slowly, his shoulders relaxing by careful degrees. He pulled the hook free of the rock crack with a sharp twist and turned to face them properly, his dark eyes sweeping over them in swift assessment. His face was all hard planes and sharp angles, copper skin drawn tight over high cheekbones. Sweat beaded on his forehead and upper lip. His jaw was set in a line that spoke of pain, held in check through will alone. The hook on his left arm was crude but functional, forged from wagon iron, and secured with leather straps scarred and worn from use. "You are the Whitcomb sisters," he said. It was not a question, but a statement of fact delivered with certainty. Hazel met his gaze and held it, using the skills she had learned reading people across telegraph lines in Chicago, catching the truth in pauses and hesitations. What she saw in this man was not cruelty or calculation. It was exhaustion and something deeper, the weight of unpaid debt. "Hazel," she said, her voice rougher than she intended. "This is Sarah." Sarah was staring at him with wide blue eyes, her face pale beneath the dust and sunburn, looking at him as though he were a ghost risen from a grave, she thought sealed forever. "Wanblee," the warrior said, offering his name with a slight nod of acknowledgement. Sarah's breath caught audibly. "The fever," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The grizzly. We thought we were certain you died out in that wash." Wanbley shook his head slowly. "Not dead. Exiled. But alive because you cut the rot from my arm with a skinning knife and burned the wound clean with fire and whiskey." Hazel's mind raced, piecing together fragments of memory from 3 months past. Sarah had found a man dying in a dry wash below their temporary camp, mauled by a grizzly, his left hand mangled beyond any hope of saving infection already spreading up his arm in angry red lines that spoke of blood poisoning and certain death. Sarah had performed an amputation with nothing but a skinning knife, sterilized in whiskey, cauterized the stump with a heated iron rod, and sat with him through 2 nights of fever while he thrashed and screamed in delirium. Hazel had helped holding the man down with her full weight, while he convulsed, heating the tools in their fire until they glowed orange, changing blood-soaked bandages through the long, dark hours. They had left him with water jerky, a blanket, and a prayer when they moved on at dawn, not knowing if he would see another sunset. "You made that," Hazel said, nodding at the hook with something approaching respect. "From wagon parts you left behind," Wanbley said. "Iron and leather and determination. You did not leave me to die alone in the dirt. Now I will not leave you to die in this desert." He looked past them, scanning the horizon with the unblinking intensity of a raptor. The rustlers were gone from immediate view, but they would circle back. They would come with reinforcements. Men like that always did. "Why do they hunt you?" he asked, his voice flat and businesslike now. Hazel and Sarah exchanged a long look, loaded with unspoken history. Sarah's face tightened, and Hazel saw guilt flicker across her twin's features. Guilt and something darker. The weight of secrets that had mass and gravity. "Because," Sarah said quietly, her voice trembling like a wire pulled too tight, "I witnessed something I was never meant to see. And then I stole something that does not belong to me, but proves what they have done." Wanbley waited in silence, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp, reading them the way a tracker reads sign on the ground. Sarah reached into the front of her dress with shaking hands and pulled out a folded piece of paper worn soft with handling and stained with sweat. A page from a ledger. It documents theft, murder, fraud, treaty violations. And the man behind it all, the man who orchestrated everything, is Captain Silas Reed of the United States Cavalry. Hazel saw Wanbley's entire body go rigid, as if struck. His jaw tightened until the muscles stood out like cables under his skin. His knuckles whitened on the rifle stock. When he spoke, his voice was barely more than a growl scraped raw from some deep well of grief. "Reed," he said, and the name carried the weight of murder and betrayal. "He killed my brother Chaska 6 months ago in Crowfoot Canyon, shot him in the back of the head and called it justified. Called it self-defense against a thief. But Chaska never stole anything in his life. He was escorting Reed under treaty agreement, and Reed murdered him to silence what he had seen. Then we have the same enemy," Hazel said grimly, feeling the pieces fall into place with the inevitability of stones rolling downhill. "And if we do not move soon and move smart, we will share the same unmarked grave." Set up spring of 1874 had arrived in the Red Oak Basin like a fist wrapped in silk, beautiful and brutal in equal measure. After weeks of cold rain that turned the land into a quagmire, the sun had returned with vengeance, baking the earth into cracked clay within days. It was country that did not forgive weakness or hesitation. Box canyons carved deep into red stone like knife wounds that never healed. Juniper thickets that tore clothes and skin with equal enthusiasm. A river that ran muddy and unpredictable, prone to flash floods that could drown a man before he had time to curse his luck. This was the country Wanbley had been wandering for 6 months since his exile, and it had become more familiar to him than the face of his own mother. Exile was a particular kind of death, the death of belonging, of purpose, of home. His Lakota band had cast him out for refusing to join a retaliatory raid against a cavalry patrol that had killed 3 hunters over a disputed boundary marked by stones and broken promises. Juan Blay had argued with the passion of the righteous that more violence would only summon more soldiers, more death, more broken bodies left for the crows and coyotes. His brother Chaska had stood beside him in that argument, had spoken with equal conviction. But the war faction had been stronger, their voices louder, their grief more immediate. When Juan Blay still refused to ride, the elders named him a coward. Chaska, caught between loyalty to his brother and duty to the band, had been assigned to escort Captain Silas Reed through Crowfoot Canyon as part of a treaty parley for safe passage of supply wagons. It was supposed to be routine, peaceful, a demonstration of cooperation. Chaska never returned. Reed claimed Chaska had tried to steal artifacts from the supply wagon and was shot in self-defense during the struggle. The band believed the lie because the alternative was war with the cavalry, and they were not ready for that war. Juan Blay's refusal to accept the lie and his insistence on investigating became insubordination. Exile was the sentence. Now Juan Blay rode a tired bay horse with a bullet graze healing badly on its left foreleg, moving through country he knew but no longer belonged to. His possessions were few, a bedroll tied behind the saddle, a canteen that always seemed half empty, a pouch of pemmican and dried berries, and the Springfield carbine that had once belonged to a Union deserter who died badly in a canyon wash 3 winters past. His left forearm ended in a scarred stump covered by a leather bracer, from which extended the iron hook he had forged himself in the coals of a trader's fire, using scrap metal and bent nails and sheer bloody-minded determination. The sisters had saved his life, and the hook was proof of their mercy. Every time he used it, every time he anchored it in rock or wood or leather, every time he worked a rifle lever or tied a knot, he remembered Sarah's steady hands cutting away ruined flesh and Hazel's eyes holding his while he bit down on rawhide to keep from screaming loud enough to bring scavengers. He owed them a debt. In his world, such debts were sacred as blood oaths. Hazel Whitcomb was 28 years old and sharp as any blade forged in Chicago's foundries. She had grown up in that city of smoke and ambition, the daughter of Thomas Whitcomb, a newspaperman who drank too much and gambled worse. When he died of a heart attack, brought on by stress and debt and the weight of secrets he could not print, his debts fell on his daughters like stones dropped from a great height. Hazel had worked as a telegraph operator, learned Morse code and how to read the invisible truths hidden in the spaces between clicks, how to catch the lies that people sent across copper wire thinking distance made them safe. One desperate winter, when the loan sharks circled with their threats and their casual cruelty, she stole $80 from the company's safe to buy time and distance. The theft was discovered within a week. She and Sarah fled west on a freight wagon, working their way across the plains as laundresses, cooks, seamstresses, and once briefly and desperately as dancers in a traveling medicine show, until the proprietor's wandering hands made staying more dangerous than leaving. Hazel could pick a lock with a hairpin and patience. She could read a contract and find the traps hidden in subordinate clauses. She could shoot a jackrabbit at 30 paces with her father's old Colt Navy revolver. She did not trust easy, and she did not forgive easily. And she carried the weight of their survival on her shoulders like a yoke she had never asked for, but could not set down. Sarah was quieter, softer in manner, but no less capable when necessity demanded. She had trained as a nurse's aide during the final year of the Civil War, working in a field hospital in Tennessee under the brutal tutelage of a surgeon named Emmett Voss. She learned how to amputate limbs with a bone saw, how to stitch arteries with horsehair thread, how to identify gangrene by smell alone. She also learned that some men screamed themselves into madness, and others went silent as stones, and both kinds haunted her dreams with equal persistence. After the war, she tried to find peace by writing simple sermons for circuit preachers, copying Bible verses in neat script, and offering comfort where she could to people who needed it desperately. But her mind sometimes played cruel tricks on her flashes of memory that felt like visions. Moments she could not place in time or verify as real. She did not speak of them often because speaking made them more real, more dangerous. They had been running for 2 years, working odd jobs from town to town, always moving, always watching the road behind them. Until Crowfoot Crossing, where they stayed too long because the work was steady and Mrs. Pike's hospitality was genuine. And Sarah made the mistake of being curious at the wrong moment. Now, with the sun climbing toward its apex and the temperature rising toward unbearable wan blee, led them north through the basin, keeping to the low ground, where sage and rabbit brush grew thick enough to offer concealment from distant eyes. The goat which Sarah had insisted on keeping despite its stubbornness and its tendency to bleat at inopportune moments, trotted between them with the resigned air of a creature that had survived worse trials than this. They did not speak much. Wanblee's presence was a quiet, solid thing like bedrock under shallow soil. He did not ask questions they were not ready to answer, and he did not fill the silence with pointless words. Hazel appreciated that more than she could articulate. She was tired of words, tired of lies, dressed up as comfort. As the sun dipped toward the western horizon, painting the stone formations in shades of copper and flame, they reached a dry wash where a stand of cottonwoods offered shade and the promise of water somewhere below the surface. Wanblee dismounted and checked his horse's injured leg with careful hands, running his fingers down the healing graze where the bullet had clipped hide and muscle. The wound was shallow, but infection was always a risk in this heat. He pressed a poultice of chewed willow bark, bitter on his tongue, medicinal and ancient, into the cut, and wrapped it with a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt, using his hook to hold the horse's leg steady while his right hand tied the bandage with economical knots. Hazel watched him work, noting the complete absence of self-pity, the way he had adapted to the loss of his hand, as though it were simply another fact of existence like weather or hunger. There was a lesson in that, she thought, though she was not sure she was ready to learn it. "You know where we are going?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Crowfoot Canyon," Wanblee said without looking up from his work. "Where your sister witnessed the dumping of stolen goods." Sarah flinched at the words, as if they were stones thrown at her. She sat on a flat rock with her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at nothing, or perhaps at something only she could see in the gathering shadows. "Tell him the rest," Hazel said quietly, moving to sit beside her twin so their shoulders touched. "He has earned the right to know what he is protecting." Sarah closed her eyes and took a slow, shuddering breath that spoke of words held back too long, pressure building behind a failing dam. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "2 weeks ago, I went to Crowfoot Canyon to gather herbs. Mrs. Pike told me yarrow grew thick near the old stone pillars, good for poultices and fever reduction. I went alone because Hazel was working the telegraph office, and I thought I would be safe in daylight. I saw 3 men on horseback unloading heavy crates from a freight wagon. They dumped them into a deep crevice near the pillars. I hid behind a rock outcropping and watched. One of the men wore a cavalry uniform with captain's insignia. I recognized him from a wanted poster that had come through the telegraph office 3 days prior, though the poster was quickly removed by order of the fort commander. Captain Silas Reed." Hazel said, her voice hard as the stones around them. "We found out his name later through Mrs. Pike's connections. He runs patrols out of Fort Sutter officially, but he is also working as an enforcer for the Red Oak mining ring. They want the canyon land for the ore deposits beneath it, but the land is protected under treaty with the Lakota bands. So Reed is orchestrating a campaign to make it appear that the Lakota are stealing government property and violating treaty terms, giving the army justification to seize the land and break the treaty." Wanblee's hand stilled on the bandage. He turned his head slowly to look at them, and Hazel saw something dangerous kindle in his eyes. Not rage exactly, but something colder and more sustainable. "Chaska," he said, his voice rough as stones grinding together. "My brother was escorting Reed through that canyon 6 months ago under treaty arrangement. Reed claimed Chaska tried to steal artifacts from the wagon. Shot him in the back of the head at close range, execution style. They buried him in the rocks and left him with no ceremony, no respect, like he was refused to be discarded." Hazel felt ice settle in her chest despite the lingering heat. "Reed killed your brother to cover his theft and ensure silence, to eliminate a witness." "Yes." Sarah's voice cracked as she continued, the words tumbling out now in a rush. "After I witnessed the dumping, I went to the telegraph office the next day. I was copying a routine message for Reed's aid, a supply request that seemed innocent. But I saw the ledger book lying open on his desk. It detailed artifact shipments with monetary values, fraudulent contracts with forged signatures, payoff schedules to local officials. I took one page while he was out of the room, folded it into my apron, and walked out. But someone noticed it missing within hours. Reed sent his men after us that same night." "And you took the whole ledger?" Wanblee said, looking at Hazel with something approaching respect. She smiled without humor. "The next night I picked the lock on the aides room at the boarding house, bluffed my way past a half-drunk guard by claiming to be a laundress, and walked out with the entire ledger hidden in the bottom of a laundry basket under soiled linens. But then the river flooded from spring melt coming down from the mountains, and we got stranded at Eli Boone's farm for 3 days while the water raged. By the time we could move again, Reed had men watching every road, every trail, every possible route out of the basin." Wanblee stood and walked to his bedroll, moving with that characteristic economy of motion. He unstrapped a small leather pouch from deep inside and brought it back to where they sat in the fading light. Inside was a braided length of black hair, bound with red thread, a beaded charm in the shape of a turtle Lakota symbol of longevity and wisdom, and a smashed cavalry badge with Reed's name engraved on the back in neat letters. "I buried these with Chaska." Wanblee said, his voice soft, but carrying unmistakable weight. "In the canyon near the pillars your sister mentions. I marked the grave with white stones from the creek bed, so I would always be able to find it again, so his spirit would not be completely lost. If we can retrieve these items and combine them with your ledger documenting the fraud, we might have enough proof to expose Reed's crimes to the territorial authorities. Maybe you get justice for your brother," Hazel said. "Maybe I am allowed to return home." Wanblee said quietly, and Hazel heard the depth of longing beneath the controlled words. There was a long silence, filled only with the whisper of wind through cottonwood leaves. The goat lay down near Sarah's feet, chewing its cud with mechanical contentment, oblivious to the weight of what was being planned. Hazel pulled a rifle from their pack, a Henry repeater with a worn stock and brass receiver, tarnished from hard use and little maintenance. She had spent the last 2 nights working on it by firelight, with tools borrowed from Eli's workshop, adapting the lever mechanism so it could be operated with one hand and a hook. She had tested it 3 times to make sure it would not jam at a critical moment. She held it out to Wanblee now with both hands like an offering. "For you," she said. "The loop goes around your hook. Pull back and twist and it chambers a fresh round. 15 shots if you keep the magazine full." Wanblee took the rifle, slowly testing the weight and balance with the careful attention of someone whose life might depend on the mechanics. His remaining fingers brushed against Hazel's as he accepted it, and the contact sent an unexpected jolt up her arm, not entirely unpleasant, but unsettling in its intensity. He met her gaze, and for a moment something passed between them that had no name yet, but felt like the beginning of understanding. "Thank you," he said, and the simple words carried more weight than elaborate speeches. You saved our lives in the desert, Hazel replied. This begins to balance the scales. Not yet. Wanblee set his dark eyes reflecting the last light of the dying sun. He looked north toward where the canyon waited in the gathering darkness. But perhaps soon, if we survive what comes next. Inciting incident. They broke camp in the dark hour before dawn, when the stars still burned cold and bright against the vast emptiness overhead, and the temperature dropped toward freezing despite the brutal heat that would return with the sun. Wanblee saddled his bay horse in silence, his movements methodical, and practiced enough to function without conscious thought. Hazel rolled their blankets with military precision and checked the loads in her Colt Navy revolver. 5 chambers filled, 1 empty, under the hammer for safety, each round precious. Sarah packed the last of their provisions, her hands trembling slightly with exhaustion or fear or both. Nightmares again? Hazel asked quietly, though she already knew the answer from the shadows under her sister's eyes. Sarah nodded without meeting her gaze. The pillars. I keep seeing them in my dreams, but not just from 2 weeks ago. From before. From a long time before. Before the dumping you witnessed. Before everything. Sarah's voice was distant, hollow. I remember being there as a child. Father took me. There was a man, a soldier with a scar. They were arguing about papers about signatures. I hid and watched through a gap in the rocks because I was not supposed to be there. Hazel felt her stomach drop, but she did not press further. Not yet. There would be time for questions once they were moving, once they had distance between themselves and Reed's hunting parties. They set out north across the basin in the gray half-light, before dawn keeping to low ground, where sage and mesquite grew thick enough to break their silhouette. The sun rose behind them like a wound opening in the sky, casting their shadows long and dark across the red earth. Wanblee rode ahead, scanning the horizon with the unblinking intensity of a hawk, his eyes tracking movement that Hazel could not see. She and Sarah walked beside the horse, leading the goat by its frayed rope. It was slower than riding, but the bay could not carry all 3 of them, not with a healing wound on its leg, not without risking permanent injury that would leave them all stranded. By mid-morning, the heat had become oppressive, wrapping around them like wet wool. Hazel's shirt clung to her back, soaked through with sweat that evaporated almost immediately in the dry air, pulling moisture from her body faster than she could replace it. Her canteen was already half empty. She forced herself to drink in small sips, making it last, knowing the next water source was miles away. They stopped in the inadequate shade of a rock overhang to rest the animals and themselves. Wanblee dismounted and checked the horizon behind them, with visible tension in his shoulders. Dust, he said flatly. 3 miles south, multiple riders moving fast. Hazel shaded her eyes with her hand and squinted against the glare. She could just make out a faint tan smudge rising against the blue dome of sky, too much dust for a single rider too organized to be wild horses. At least 4 mounted men, maybe more. Reed's hunters, she said, stating the obvious, because sometimes naming a threat made it manageable. They are tracking us with purpose, Wanblee said. They will close the distance by nightfall if we maintain this pace. We need faster transport or better defensive ground. We cannot push the horse harder. Sarah said, her voice tight with worry. That leg wound will not hold up to a sustained run. We risk permanent lameness. Wanblee looked at the bay horse, then at the sisters, calculating distances and probabilities with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years weighing survival odds. Then, we need to acquire another horse or wagon, something with capacity and speed. Where? Hazel asked, hearing the edge of desperation in her own voice. The nearest settlement was Crowfoot Crossing itself, 10 miles east, and swarming with Reed's informants. Suicide to return there. Eli Boone's homestead. Sarah said suddenly, her voice gaining strength. It is only 5 miles northeast, situated in the fold of land near Willow Creek. He sheltered us during the flood last month, gave us food and blankets when we had nothing. Will he help again? Juan Blay asked, his tone neutral, but his eyes sharp. The mining ring flooded his best field last spring, Sarah said. Deliberately redirected tailings runoff from their operation upstream, poisoned his water source, and killed half his crop. His wife Martha drank from the creek before they realized it was contaminated. She died 3 months ago from some kind of mineral poisoning. The doctor could not identify what exactly, but everyone knew. Eli hates the ring with a passion that borders on madness. He will help us, if only for the chance to hurt them. Wanblee nodded once decisively. Then we go to him, fast as we can manage. They struck out northeast at an increased pace, angling toward the low hills where Eli Boone's farm sat like a defiant fist, raised against the indifference of the land. The dust cloud behind them grew steadily closer, resolving into individual shapes. Now mounted men spread out in a search line, methodical and professional. Hazel could hear the faint sound of hoofbeats, carried on the wind, a sound that made her pulse accelerate and her mouth go dry. They were not going to make it in time. The math was simple and brutal. Then Sarah stopped abruptly, as if she had walked into an invisible wall. Her face went pale as fresh milk, and her eyes lost focus, staring at something that existed only in memory. "What is it?" Hazel demanded, gripping her sister's arm hard enough to leave marks, trying to anchor her to the present. "The pillars." Sarah whispered, her voice strange and distant. "I remember now. Not just recently. From when I was 9 years old. Father took me to that canyon. To meet a man, a soldier." Hazel felt ice form in her chest despite the hammering heat. "What are you saying?" Sarah's words came slowly, dragged up from some deep place. "They signed papers by those pillars. I was not supposed to be there. Father told me to wait by the wagon. But I followed and hid behind a rock. I watched through a crack. The soldier had a terrible scar on his jaw from temple to chin. They were arguing. Father was crying. I had never seen him cry before. The soldier said the contract would settle the debt, that it was the only way. Father said it was monstrous. The soldier said it was business. Father signed. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely hold the pen. "What did he sign?" Hazel asked, though part of her already knew, already felt the terrible weight of understanding settling onto her shoulders like a yoke. "A contract." Sarah said, tears streaming down her face, now cutting tracks through the dust. "Giving us, you and me, to the ring, not as wives, as workers. Indentured labor to settle his gambling debts. 10 years of service in their boarding houses and laundries. Essentially slaves with a legal veneer. The soldier was Captain Reed. I am certain of it now. The scar, the uniform, everything matches. Reed has been waiting all these years for an excuse to enforce that contract. And when Father died, when we fled Chicago, we made ourselves fugitives. We gave Reed the justification he needed." Hazel felt the ground tilt beneath her. She reached out and found Wanblee's arm, solid and real, anchoring her to the present moment. "You are saying Father signed us into bondage to pay his debts, that this was arranged years before any of the recent events?" "Yes," Sarah whispered. "And I forgot. I blocked it out. The memory was too terrible. But seeing the pillars again, it broke something open in my mind. This is not just about silencing witnesses to theft. Reed wants to enforce that contract. He wants to own us legally. And if we resist, he has every legal right to hunt us down as fugitives from a binding debt agreement." Wanblee's voice cut through the rising panic with the edge of cold steel. Where is this contract now? Reed must have it, Sarah said. Legal documents that valuable, he would keep them close, either on his person or locked in the fort's records office. But there is more. More. Hazel felt like the world was unraveling faster than she could process. The debt father owed was not natural. Sarah continued the words, tumbling out in a rush now. The original loan was modest $50 to cover my medical treatment when I had scarlet fever as a teenager. But the ring charged compound interest at rates that should have been illegal. Within a year, $50 became $500. Within 2 years, it was $5,000. Father could never repay it. They engineered it that way deliberately. They wanted control over his newspaper, wanted to dictate what he could print about their mining operations and treaty violations. When he tried to resist, tried to expose them, they threatened to kill us. So he signed that contract to buy time to keep us safe while he gathered evidence. But he died of a heart attack before he could use what he had found. And we have been running ever since without even knowing the full truth of what we were running from. Hazel stared at her sister, feeling betrayal and sympathy war inside her chest. Why did you not tell me this before? Why keep it hidden? Because I only remembered pieces, Sarah said desperately. The full memory only returned when I saw those pillars 2 weeks ago. And I was terrified you would blame me for Father's death, for the debt, for everything. Terrified you would hate me. So I went to the canyon alone to verify my memory before saying anything. And that is when I witnessed Reed's men dumping the stolen artifacts. One secret led to another, and I kept digging myself deeper, and I am sorry. I am so sorry. Hazel wanted to rage, to scream, to hit something. But the dust cloud was closer now, much closer, and there was no time for the luxury of anger. She pulled Sarah into a brief, fierce embrace. We will discuss this later. Right now, we survive. Understood. Sarah nodded against her shoulder, shaking with sobs. Can you ride? Wombly asked quietly. Yes, Sarah managed. Then get on the horse with me. We run for Boone's farm. All speed now. They ran. First obstacle. They reached Eli Boone's homestead just as the sun kissed the horizon, turning the sky into layered bands of crimson and deep purple that looked like bruises spreading across the vault of heaven. The farm was a collection of weathered structures that seemed to be losing a slow battle with entropy, a sod-roofed cabin with a stone chimney leaning at a precarious angle, a barn whose walls had been patched so many times the original wood was barely visible, and a chicken coop held together with determination and baling wire. The creek that ran past the property was swollen from spring melt, running fast and brown with suspended silt. Eli himself stood in the yard, loading hay onto a flatbed wagon pulled by a swayback mule that looked nearly as old as he was. He was in his 50s, lean and weathered as old leather, with a grizzled beard gone more gray than brown and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He looked up as they burst into the clearing in a cloud of dust, and his weathered face split into a surprised grin that quickly faded when he saw the riders cresting the hill behind them. Sarah Whitcomb, he called out, his voice carrying clearly. Thought the spring flood carried you off to judgment. Not yet. Sarah gasped from her perch behind Wanblee on the bay horse. But it is making a determined effort. Eli's expression went hard as stone as he counted the pursuing riders, 5 men now spread out in a loose formation designed to cut off escape routes. He dropped his pitchfork and reached for the double-barreled shotgun leaning against the wagon wheel with deceptive casualness. Inside, he said, his voice flat and carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Now, all of you. They did not waste time arguing. Wanblee dismounted and led the bay horse into the barn. At a run, stripping the saddle off with practiced efficiency, despite the awkward angle required to work one-handed. Hazel herded Sarah and the protesting goat into the cabin and dropped the heavy bar across the door. Through the cracked window, the glass long since replaced with oiled paper, she watched the riders approach with the inexorable quality of a slow-motion avalanche. Eli stepped into the yard shotgun, cradled with deceptive ease in the crook of his arm, his posture relaxed, but his eyes glacial. "Help you, boys." He called out, his voice carrying just the right note of rural hospitality, mixed with barely concealed threat. The lead rider reined up 10 feet from him, raising a hand to signal his companions to halt. He was a big man with shoulders like a bull and a drooping mustache stained yellow from tobacco juice. A scar ran from his temple to his jaw, pulling his mouth into a permanent sneer. Murdoch Hazel remembered from descriptions she had heard in Crowfoot Crossing, one of Reed's most trusted enforcers, known for taking Lakota scalps during the territorial campaigns and displaying them as trophies. Looking for 2 women and an Indian. Murdoch said, his voice flat and bored, as if this were routine business. "Fugitives from justice. Seen them come through here?" "Nope," Eli said with the easy drawl of someone telling a transparent lie and not caring if it was believed. "Just me and my chickens. And they are not much for conversation even when I am drunk enough to try." Murdoch's smile widened, but carried no humor whatsoever. "That is real amusing, old man. Mind if we take a look around your property, official business and all?" "I do mind, actually. This is private land. You got a warrant signed by a territorial judge?" "Do not need a warrant for fugitives in active pursuit." Murdoch set his hand, drifting toward the revolver holstered at his hip. "Then you are going to need to explain to my cousin why you came onto my land without permission," Eli said calmly. "Jonah Pike, deputy sheriff in Crowfoot Crossing. He takes family insults mighty personal." Murdoch hesitated just for a second, but it was enough to break the momentum. Hazel saw him calculating odds, weighing the potential trouble against the certainty of his orders from Reed. Then Wanbley stepped out of the barn with the Henry rifle, raised the loop around his hook, holding it absolutely steady. The barrel was pointed with professional precision at the center of Murdoch's chest. "Leave, now," Wanbley said, his voice carrying no anger, no threat, just flat certainty. "Or stay forever." Murdoch stared at him, at the rifle, at Eli with his shotgun. His jaw worked as if chewing over unpleasant truths. Finally, he hawked and spat tobacco juice into the dust. "You are making a fatal mistake, old man," Murdoch said, looking at Eli but speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "Captain Reed does not forget offenses, and he does not forgive them. You are dead, all of you. Just a matter of time now." "Time is all any of us have," Eli said philosophically. "Might as well spend it standing up instead of kneeling." The riders wheeled their horses with a coordinated precision that spoke of military training or long practice, and rode back toward the ridge at a canter that kicked up substantial dust. But Hazel knew with cold certainty that they would not go far. They would circle around to higher ground, wait for darkness when the advantage shifted, and return with fire and bullets and professional murder. Wanbley lowered the rifle slowly and turned to Eli. "Thank you for the stand. They will be back." "I know it," Eli said grimly. "Which gives us maybe an hour before full dark. Not enough time to ford up proper. Not enough to run far enough to matter." He paused, studying them with those sharp blue eyes. "You are going to need transport. Fast transport. And you are going to need it loaded with supplies for a long run through hard country." "We cannot pay you now," Hazel said, stepping out of the cabin. "But when this is finished, do not want payment." Eli interrupted, waving off the offer like an annoying fly. "Want Reed and his ring bastards to pay for what they did to Martha?" poisoned her slow and painful, watched her die by inches, and could not do a damn thing to stop it. You bring Reed down, that is payment enough for me. He spat into the dust. But there is a condition. I need help first. Wind tore my hayloft door clean off its hinges last week during that big storm. Cannot lift it back into place alone. Need 2 strong backs in about 45 minutes. Then the wagon and mule are yours. We do not have 45 minutes, Hazel said, hearing the edge of desperation in her voice. You have exactly that much time before those men circle around and come back with torches and murder on their minds, Eli said flatly. So we work fast and we work smart. Or we all die here in this yard. Your choice. Hazel looked at Wanblee. He nodded once. We work, Hazel said. They moved with desperate efficiency. Wanblee and Eli hauled the massive wooden door from where it lay half buried in the barn to the loft opening 20 feet overhead, using a jury-rigged pulley system made from old rope and rusted iron rings. The door was solid oak, heavy as sin, and every muscle in Hazel's body screamed as she and Sarah held it steady from below, while Wanblee climbed the ladder with his hammer and a mouthful of iron spikes, working one-handed with the hook as an anchor point. He drove the spikes through the heavy iron hinges with ringing blows that echoed across the valley, like a dinner bell, announcing their location to anyone listening. The space in the loft was cramped and hot-smelling of old hay and mouse droppings. Hazel found herself pressed shoulder to shoulder with Wanblee as they maneuvered the door into position, and their bodies close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him, smell the sweat and leather, and something else, sage maybe, or the particular scent of a man who spent his life outdoors. Their eyes met as he swung the hammer for the final time, and something passed between them. Not attraction exactly. Not yet, but awareness. Recognition that they were bound together now by necessity and blood and shared danger. Hold it steady, he said quietly, his voice rough from exertion. I am holding. She replied, her arms trembling with the effort of bracing the weight. He drove the final spike home with 3 solid blows that seated it deep into the oak, and the door settled into place with a solid thunk that spoke of security. Eli tested it from below, pushing hard enough to make the hinges creak but not give. That will hold through winter storms, he pronounced. Good work. Now load up and get moving before. The first rifle shot interrupted him, cracking through the twilight with sharp authority. The bullet punched through the barn wall, sending splinters flying. More shots followed in rapid succession, a coordinated volley from multiple positions on the ridge above. They are back early, Eli said with remarkable calm. Must have circled faster than I thought. He grabbed his shotgun and fired both barrels toward the muzzle flashes, the boom deafening in the confined space. Load the wagon, move. They moved. Hazel and Sarah threw supplies into the wagon bed, with no regard for organization burlap sacks of cornmeal and dried beans, the small barrel of water already lashed to the side strips of salted pork wrapped in waxed paper, a coil of rope, a hatchet, 2 wool blankets, a handful of candles, ammunition for the rifles. Eli tossed in his battered map of the basin with the safest routes marked in faded ink and charcoal. Follow the low route through Demon's Throat Pass, he shouted over the gunfire. Keeps you off the skyline. Watch for washouts where the creek flooded. Come with us, Sarah urged, grabbing his arm. Cannot, Eli said, shaking her off gently. Someone has to hold them here, slow them down, give you time to get clear. Besides, this is my land. Martha is buried under that cottonwood yonder. I am not leaving her to these bastards. More bullets hammered the barn. One shattered through the window of the cabin, and Hazel heard glass, real glass, expensive, exploding inward. The horses in the corral were screaming in panic. Get on that wagon and drive like the devil himself is chasing you, Eli commanded, because he is. They scrambled onto the wagon bench. Hazel grabbed the reins while Sarah clutched the ledger to her chest. Wanblee crouched in the back, the Henry rifle up and ready. The goat somehow clambered in as well, bleating indignantly. Hazel snapped the reins across the mule's back, and the old animal surged forward with surprising strength, born of panic and long experience with danger. The wagon lurched into motion, wheels bouncing violently over the rutted yard. Wanblee fired steadily, methodically, not aiming to kill, but to suppress and delay. His shots were carefully placed, one clipped a rider's saddle cinch, and the leather parted with a snap, dumping the man hard into the dirt, where he lay stunned. Another round sparked off a stirrup, and the horse reared, throwing its rider into a painful sprawl. Eli stood in his yard, firing his shotgun at the advancing riders, reloading with practiced speed, shouting curses that would have made a mule skinner blush. They reached Willow Creek at full speed. The mule plunged into the water without hesitation, chest deep in the swift current. The wagon tilted violently to the left as the current grabbed the wheels, and for one terrifying heartbeat, Hazel thought they were going over. Water poured over the sideboard, soaking their supplies and legs. Sarah screamed and grabbed Hazel's arm with both hands, nails digging in hard enough to draw blood. The goat bleated in pure terror. Then the mule found purchase on the rocky bottom and surged forward with strength Hazel would not have believed possible, dragging the tilting wagon up the far bank in a spray of mud and water. They crashed through brush on the far side and into the relative darkness of the low hills. Behind them, she heard Eli's shotgun boom twice more, then fall silent. She heard men shouting. She heard the crackle of flames. "Do not look back," Wanblee said quietly from behind her, but she looked anyway. Eli's barn was burning flames, licking up the sides and catching on the dry wood like it had been soaked in kerosene. The cabin was burning too, and she could not see Eli anywhere. "He gave us time," Wanblee said. "Honor it by surviving." Hazel faced forward and drove the exhausted mule harder than she had any right to, pushing through the gathering darkness toward a destination she could only hope they would reach before Reed's hunters ran them down and finished what they had started. Rising action. They traveled through the night by moonlight, the wagon rattling over stones and hard-packed earth, the mules breathing harsh and labored in the darkness. Hazel's arms ached from fighting the reins, muscles screaming protest with every jolt. Her eyes burned from squinting into shadows, trying to make out the path ahead by starlight alone. They could not risk a lantern, the flame would be visible for miles. Beside her, Sarah sat rigid and silent, clutching the ledger wrapped in oilcloth against her chest, like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to sanity. In the back of the wagon, Wanblee dozed fitfully despite the constant jarring the rifle across his lap, his body swaying with each lurch. By dawn, they had put perhaps 10 miles between themselves and Eli's burning farm, following the low route through Demon's Throat Pass, just as he had advised. The passage was a narrow cleft between towering walls of red stone, barely wide enough for the wagon. In places, they had to stop and clear fallen rocks from flash floods, working in tense silence, while Wanblee kept watch from a high point, scanning for pursuit. When they finally emerged into open country again, the sun was already climbing, promising another day of brutal heat. They stopped in the shade of an overhanging cliff to rest the mule and themselves. Hazel's hands were raw and blistered, the skin peeling away in strips. She soaked them in water from the barrel, hissing at the sting. "How far to the canyon?" she asked Wanblee, who was checking his ammunition with methodical care. "Half a day if we push," he said. "But we need to find Dr. Voss first. Get the bullet he pulled from Chaska's body. Without it, the ledger and my brother's belongings are not enough proof." "Where is this doctor?" Hazel asked. "Old copper mine about 5 miles northeast," Wanblee said, consulting landmarks against memory. "Abandoned for years. Good place to hide if you are wanted by the army." "And he is?" Sarah asked quietly. "Deserter." Wanblee confirmed. Left his post during the Atlanta campaign. Been hiding in these hills for near 10 years. But he witnessed what Reed did to Chaska. Wrote to me months ago, told me he kept the bullet as proof. Said if I ever needed testimony, he would provide it, even knowing it might cost him his life. They set out again, angling northeast across a rough country, where the wagon wheels bounced over exposed rock and the mules struggled for footing. The land here was broken and hostile, carved by ancient water into a maze of arroyos and mesas. Perfect country for ambush. Hazel felt the weight of eyes on them constantly, though she saw nothing. Just heat shimmer and the endless expanse of red stone and blue sky. They reached the mine entrance in early afternoon. It was little more than a black hole carved into the side of a cliff, surrounded by rusted equipment and rotting timbers that looked ready to collapse at the first strong wind. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways, and it smelled of damp earth and decay. "Dr. Voss." Sarah called out, her voice echoing strangely. "It is Sarah Whitcomb, from Tennessee. I need your help." For a long moment there was no response. Then a voice echoed from the darkness inside, rough from disuse. "Sarah, little Sarah Whitcomb cannot be." A figure emerged, a man in his 60s, gaunt and stooped, with a wild gray beard and eyes that burned with fever or madness, or both. He wore the tattered remnants of a Union surgeon's coat, and his hands shook as he held up a letter. "Got word you might come," he said, his voice cracking. "Been waiting, praying." Sarah ran to him and embraced him, and the old man wept openly, clinging to her. "Dr. Voss," she said, "we need the bullet, the one from Chaska." "I have it," he said, pulling a cloth bundle from his coat with trembling hands. Kept it safe. Knew it would matter. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a flattened lead bullet. "Reed's gun. I pulled it from the skull myself. Saw him do it. Saw the whole thing." Wanblee took the bullet, reverently examining the rifling marks. "This matches a Colt Army revolver, standard cavalry issue." "Reed's personal weapon." Voss confirmed. "I was gathering herbs near the canyon when I heard shouting. Hid and watched. Reed accused your brother of stealing. Chaska said Reed was framing him. Reed did not hesitate. Shot him execution style, point blank, then covered the body with rocks." "Will you testify?" Hazel asked. "If I must," Voss said, "though it means a rope for me. Desertion in wartime. But Martha's death." He paused, confusion crossing his face. "No, that was someone else's wife. My mind wanders. But yes, I will testify. For the boy. For justice." Suddenly the ground shook. A deep, grinding rumble echoed from inside the mine. Dust billowed from the entrance in a choking cloud. "Cave in," Voss shouted. "The timbers are rotten, move." But it was too late. The entrance collapsed with a deafening roar, sealing them outside but trapping their wagon and supplies inside in a cloud of choking dust. Worse, through the settling dust, Hazel saw riders cresting the ridge above. 6 of them. Murdoch in the lead. "Run," Wanblee said flatly. They ran up a narrow trail cut into the cliff face, scrambling over loose scree that shifted treacherously under their boots. Bullets whined past them, sparking off rock. Hazel felt one tug at her sleeve so close it burned the skin beneath. The trail ended at a narrow ledge with a sheer drop on one side and vertical rock on the other. They were trapped. Wanblee turned and raised the Henry, firing methodically. His shots were aimed not to kill, but to pin the pursuers down, buying seconds. But they were running out of ammunition and options. "There," Sarah pointed to a crack in the rock face. "A fissure. We can squeeze through." They did, scraping skin and tearing clothes, crawling through darkness, while behind them, Murdoch's men closed in. The fissure opened into a small cave, barely large enough for the four of them and the goat. "We are trapped," Hazel said, her voice hollow. "No," Wanblee said, pointing to the back of the cave where daylight showed through a narrow opening. "There. But it is a long drop to the canyon floor, 30 feet at least." "We use the rope from the wagon," Voss said, "if we can reach it." Wanblee crawled back to the fissure entrance and waited. When a rider came close, he fired once. The man fell. Wanblee grabbed his gun belt and ammunition, then retreated. "That buys us minutes," he said. "No more." They tied strips of cloth together with the rope Eli had given them, fashioning a crude line barely long enough. Wanblee tested it, then lowered Sarah first, his hook anchored around a rock projection. Then Hazel, their hands touching as she gripped the rope, her eyes meeting his. "Do not let go," she said. "Never," he replied. She descended the rope, burning her already raw palms, and dropped the last 6 feet to land hard on the canyon floor. Sarah caught her, kept her upright. Voss came next then. Wanblee lowering himself one-handed with the rifle slung across his back. They were in Crowfoot Canyon at last. The stone pillars rose before them like ancient sentinels, and somewhere in the rocks above Murdoch and his men were coming. Midpoint twist. They moved quickly through the canyon, following Wanblee's memory of where he had buried his brother. The stone pillars loomed overhead, carved with symbols Hazel could not read, but that filled her with an inexplicable sense of violated holiness. The air was still here, heavy with the weight of the dead. Wanblee stopped at a cairn of white stones near the base of the largest pillar. He knelt and began moving them aside with his hook and his one hand working with reverent care. Beneath was a shallow depression, and in it, wrapped in oilcloth, were Chaska's belongings, a beaded belt, a medicine pouch, and a journal written in a mixture of Lakota and English. He kept a journal. Wanblee said, wonder and pain mixing in his voice. "I did not know. He documented everything, Reed's threats, the thefts, all of it." Sarah knelt beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "Then we have everything. The ledger, the bullet, the journal, Dr. Voss's testimony. We can—" "No, you do not," a voice said from behind them. They spun. Dr. Emmett Voss stood there, but he was holding a revolver, now pointed at them with a steady hand that no longer trembled. His eyes were clear, lucid, and filled with something that looked like deep regret. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said quietly. "I truly am. But you need to understand something. The debt your father owed, the one that started this nightmare, it was not accidental. It was engineered. By me." Hazel felt the ground drop out from under her. "What?" "I was the doctor your father hired to treat Sarah's fever." Voss said, his voice hollow. "The ring approached me months before, told me to inflate the bill, make it so large your father could never pay it. They wanted hold over him because of his newspaper. They needed to control what he printed about their mining operations. I did it. $200 for treatment that should have cost $20. Started the debt spiral that destroyed your family." Sarah's face went white. You are saying you deliberately—" "Yes," Voss said simply. "I was paid $500. It seemed like so much money at the time. I told myself I was just following orders, that it was business, that someone else would have done it if I had not. But I was wrong. I have been living with that guilt for 15 years. When I witnessed Reed kill Chaska, I saw my chance for redemption. Kept the bullet as proof. Wrote to Wanblee. I thought if I could help bring Reed down, it would balance the scale somehow." "Why tell us now?" Hazel demanded, her hand inching toward her revolver. "Because Reed is here," Voss said. "He found me 2 days ago, Offered me a choice, help him set a trap for you in exchange for a pardon for desertion and enough money to start over. Or die in this canyon. I chose to live. I am sorry. I am a coward, and always have been. Where is he? Juan Blay asked, his voice deadly calm. All around you. Captain Silas Reed's voice echoed from the rocks above. They looked up. Reed stood on an outcropping 20 feet overhead, flanked by 8 armed men positioned at strategic points around the canyon. He wore full cavalry uniform, his revolver holstered his face, a mask of cold satisfaction. Took you long enough to get here, Reed said conversationally. I have been waiting since yesterday. Dr. Voss sent word when you left the mine. Gave me plenty of time to prepare a proper welcome. Hazel saw it then, the sticks of dynamite placed at intervals along the canyon walls, fuses running to a central point, where one of Reed's men held a lit torch. You cannot blow the canyon, Sarah said desperately. The artifacts you stole are still here. Your evidence of Lakota theft. Already removed them 3 days ago, Reed said. Voss told me you were coming for evidence, so I cleaned house. The crevice is empty now. And when this canyon comes down, it will bury you your evidence and any inconvenient questions about what happened to the Whitcomb sisters and their savage friend. The ledger proves everything, Hazel shouted. A ledger I will claim is forged, Reed replied. Who will believe a thief and a deserter over a decorated cavalry officer? The bullet, I will say, Voss fabricated it for revenge. The journal, written in a language most territorial judges cannot read. Without you alive to testify, I have plausible deniability for everything. Why not just shoot us? Wanbley asked. Because I need it to look like an accident, Reed said. A tragic cave-in that killed 3 fugitives who were trespassing on treaty lands. Clean. No questions. And as a bonus, I get to enforce the labor contract your father signed posthumously against your estate. The ring gets your father's newspaper building in Chicago as damages. Everyone wins, except you. Voss lowered his revolver, shame written across his face. I am sorry, he said again. I am so sorry. You sold us. Sarah said, her voice breaking. I sold myself a long time ago, Voss said. This is just the price finally coming due. Reed gestured. The man with the torch moved toward the fuses. Any last words? Reed asked. Wanbley looked at Hazel. Their eyes met, and in that moment something fundamental shifted between them. The motivation changed. This was no longer about justice or revenge or freedom. It was simpler than that. More primal. Survival. Together. At any cost. Yes, Wanbley said. 1. He fired the Henry rifle from the hip, not at Reed, but at the man holding the torch. The shot was impossible, 30 yards upward angle moving target. But the bullet struck true. The man screamed and dropped the torch into the dust, where it sputtered harmlessly. Then chaos erupted. Second obstacle. Reed's men opened fire from their positions, turning the canyon into a kill box. Bullets hammered the ground around them, kicking up geysers of dust and stone fragments. Hazel dove behind the cairn, dragging Sarah with her. Wanbley rolled to cover behind a rock outcropping, working the Henry's lever with his hook in smooth, practiced motions. Voss stood frozen in the middle of the canyon, his revolver hanging uselessly at his side. Move! Hazel screamed at him. A bullet took Voss in the shoulder, spinning him around. He stumbled and fell to his knees, blood spreading across his tattered coat. Sarah started to run to him, but Hazel grabbed her and held her back. He betrayed us, Hazel hissed. He saved us too. Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. He told us about the trap. He could have stayed silent. Wanblee was firing steadily, methodically, making every shot count. Two of Reed's men went down, one clutching his leg, the other his shoulder. But there were too many, too well positioned. They were being suppressed, pinned down, with nowhere to run. "The drainage channel," Sarah said suddenly. "From my memory. It is over there." She pointed to a pile of driftwood and debris blocking a narrow cut in the canyon wall. "If we can clear it, the water trapped in the upper catchment will flood through. It will wash them out." "How much water?" Hazel demanded. "Enough to fill the canyon floor 3 feet deep," Sarah said. "Maybe more after the spring melt." "Then we clear it," Wanblee said. "Cover me." He ran in a crouch toward the debris pile, bullets whining past him. Hazel fired her revolver at the muzzle flashes above, not hoping to hit, but to make them duck. Sarah grabbed Voss's dropped revolver and fired too, her hands shaking, but her aim steady enough to matter. Wanblee reached the pile and began pulling at the logs with his one hand, and his hook working with desperate speed. The logs were heavy, waterlogged, wedged together like a dam. He got one free, then another. A bullet struck the rock beside his head, and he flinched but kept working. Hazel ran to help him, her revolver empty, now useless. She grabbed a log and pulled with all her strength. It shifted. Sarah joined them, all three working together. Above them, Reed was shouting orders. His men were advancing down the canyon walls, closing in for the kill. Voss, bleeding and pale, crawled toward them. "Let me," he gasped. "Let me do this one thing right." He reached the pile and threw his weight against a key log. It shifted. The entire structure groaned. A bullet took Voss in the back. He arched, mouth opening in a soundless scream. But he did not let go. He pulled with the last of his strength. The dam broke. Water surged through the channel with a roar like thunder pouring into the canyon in a brown, frothing torrent. It spread across the floor, rising with terrifying speed. Two of Reed's men were swept off their feet immediately, tumbling away in the current. The others scrambled for higher ground, firing wildly now. Voss slumped forward into the water. Sarah grabbed him, trying to pull him to safety, but he was too heavy, the current too strong. "Let me go," he whispered. "This is my atonement. The bullet, it is in my left pocket. Use it. Finish this." He slipped from Sarah's grasp and was swept away, disappearing into the churning brown water. Sarah sobbed once, then reached into the water where he had fallen and found the cloth bundle. She pulled it out, clutching it to her chest. "We have it," she said. "We have the proof." But they were still trapped. The water was rising, already knee-deep. And Reed was still up there, still armed, still determined to bury them. Wanblee grabbed Hazel's hand. "Can you climb?" "Yes." "Then we go up. Fast." They scrambled up a narrow trail on the canyon wall, using handholds and footholds that barely existed, the water churning below them. Hazel's injured hands screamed in protest, blood making the rock slippery. Behind her, Sarah climbed with the ledger and bullet bundles strapped to her back with strips of cloth. They reached a ledge 30 feet up, gasping for breath. Below, the water continued to rise. Above, they could see Reed's men repositioning, trying to get a clear shot. "We have to get to higher ground," Wanblee said. "To the rim. It is our only chance." They climbed, hand over hand, foot by foot, muscles screaming. Hazel felt her grip failing her raw hands, unable to hold on much longer. She slipped her boot, losing purchase on wet stone. Wanblee's hook shot out and caught her belt. He pulled her up, his face a mask of concentration and pain, his wounded shoulder from days ago reopening under the strain. Their faces were inches apart, both of them trembling with effort. "I have you," he said. "I know," she replied. They reached the rim together, just as the sun touched the western horizon, painting the sky blood red. They collapsed on solid ground chests, heaving. But there was no time to rest. Reed was there, standing 20 feet away, his revolver drawn and pointed at them. "Impressive," he said, "but futile." Behind him stood Murdoch and 3 other men, all armed, all aiming at them. "You cannot win," Reed said. "Even with your evidence, even if you somehow escape this canyon, I have resources you cannot imagine. The ring will protect me. Judges will rule in my favor. You are nobody. You have nothing. We have the truth," Sarah said, rising to her feet with the ledger and bullet clutched in her hands. "Truth is what people with power say it is," Reed replied. "And you have no power." Wanblee stood slowly, the Henry rifle in his hands. Blood seeped through his shirt from multiple wounds. He swayed but did not fall. "I have this," he said quietly. "1 rifle against 5 men," Reed said. "Poor odds." "I only need 1 shot," Wanblee replied. The moment stretched. The sun dipped lower, and in the distance, Hazel heard something. Hoofbeats, many of them. Reed heard it too. His expression flickered with uncertainty for the first time. Over the rim of the canyon rode a dozen horsemen. Leading them was a woman, Mrs. Lydia Pike, the schoolteacher from Crowfoot Crossing. Behind her rode her husband Jonah, the deputy, and a collection of farmers, miners, and townspeople, all armed. "Captain Reed." Mrs. Pike called out, her voice carrying clear across the distance. "You are under arrest." Climax Reed's face twisted with rage. "You have no authority here. This is military authority." "Not anymore," Mrs. Pike said, dismounting. She held up a sheaf of papers. "These are federal warrants signed by the territorial governor himself. Charges of theft, murder, fraud, and conspiracy. Your ring friends could not protect you this time. Too many people saw Eli Boone's farm burning. Too many asked questions. The governor sent Marshal Caleb Thorne to investigate. He is 3 hours behind us with federal troops." "This is not over," Reed snarled. He gestured to his men. "Take them." Murdoch and the others raised their weapons. "No," Jonah Pike said quietly. He stepped forward, his own revolver drawn, and pointed at Murdoch. "It is over. Stand down." "You are choosing them over us?" Murdoch asked incredulously. "I am choosing law over murder," Jonah said. "I am choosing to live with myself. Something you stopped doing a long time ago." For a moment, violence hung in the air, like heat shimmer. Then Murdoch lowered his weapon. The others followed suit. Except Reed. He moved faster than Hazel would have thought possible for a man his age. His revolver came up, aimed directly at Sarah, who held the evidence. "If I cannot have vindication, neither will you," he said. Wanblee moved. Despite his wounds, despite exhaustion, despite having only 1 hand, he moved with the fluid economy of someone who had spent his entire life in combat. He threw himself between Reed and Sarah, his body intercepting the line of fire. Reed's revolver barked. Once, twice, 3 times. The bullets took Wanblee in the chest and shoulders, spinning him around. He fell hard, the Henry rifle clattering from his grip. "No!" Hazel screamed. Time seemed to slow. She saw Sarah's face white with shock. She saw Reed smiling, satisfied. She saw Wanblee lying still on the ground, blood spreading beneath him. Something inside Hazel broke. Or perhaps it was something that had been broken for years, finally snapping back into place. She ran forward, not away from danger, but toward it, directly at Reed. Her empty revolver was useless, but she used it anyway, swinging it like a club. Reed tried to bring his gun around, but she was inside his reach, fueled by rage and desperation and love she had not known she was capable of feeling. She drove the revolver into his face with everything she had. Bone crunched. Blood sprayed. Reed staggered backward. Jonah Pike fired once. The bullet took Reed in the leg, dropping him. Hazel fell to her knees beside Wanblee, her hands pressed against the wounds in his chest, trying futilely to stop the bleeding. His eyes were open, still conscious, looking at her with an expression she could not name. "You are not dying," she said fiercely, tears streaming down her face. "You are not leaving me. Do you understand? You do not get to save my life and then die. That is not how this works." "Sarah," Wanblee whispered, blood bubbling from his lips. "The hook. Twist it. Secret compartment." Sarah knelt beside them, her hands shaking as she twisted the iron hook on Wanblee's arm. It came apart in her hands, revealing a hollow interior. Inside was a small leather pouch. "What?" she began. "Another bullet," Wanblee gasped. "From Chaska's body, I kept one. Insurance. In case Voss was compromised. Always have backup evidence." "You clever bastard," Hazel said, laughing and crying at the same time. "You absolute clever bastard." "Mrs. Pike," Sarah called out. "He needs a doctor, now." "Nearest is 6 hours away," Mrs. Pike said, kneeling beside them. "But I know field medicine. Let me see." She examined the wounds with quick, efficient hands. 2 bullets went through, clean exits. The third is lodged near his lung. I can extract it, but it will hurt like hellfire, and he might not survive the shock. "Do it," Wanblee said. "Not dying, in this canyon. Not after everything." Mrs. Pike worked by firelight as the sun set completely, using tools from her saddlebag needle thread whiskey for sterilization. A knife heated in the flames. Sarah assisted, her hands steady despite the tears on her face. Hazel held Wanblee's remaining hand, squeezing tight enough to hurt, feeling his pulse stuttering but refusing to stop. He screamed when Mrs. Pike dug out the bullet, a raw sound that echoed across the canyon. Then he went limp. "He is alive," Mrs. Pike said. "Unconscious, but alive. We need to get him to proper shelter. He needs days of rest and care." Jonah Pike had Reed and his men bound and under guard. He walked over to where Hazel knelt. "We found Eli Boone," he said quietly. "Alive. Burned badly, but alive. He crawled into his root cellar when the barn collapsed. Told us everything before he passed out. His testimony, combined with your evidence, is more than enough to bury Reed and the ring." Hazel looked at the ledger. Sarah still clutched at the 2 bullets, one from Voss, one from Wanblee's hidden cache at Chaska's journal. They had the proof. They had witnesses. They had survived. They had won. But the price had been terrible. Falling action. They made camp in the canyon that night, unwilling to move Wanblee until daylight. Sarah sat beside him, monitoring his breathing, changing bandages, whispering prayers she had not spoken in years. Hazel sat on the other side, holding his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin and the pulse that grew steadier as the hours passed. They had wired the territorial marshal overnight, and the message riding the telegraph lines ahead. Marshal Caleb Thorne arrived at dawn with 20 mounted troops. He was a grim-faced man in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He examined the evidence methodically, the ledger, the bullets, Chaska's journal, the testimonies from Mrs. Pike, Jonah, and the townspeople who had witnessed Eli's farm burning. "This is enough," he said finally. "More than enough. Reed will hang, and I will personally ensure the ring executives in Denver and Santa Fe are arrested and prosecuted." "What about the labor contract?" Hazel asked. "The one binding us to the ring." Thorne examined it when Jonah produced it from Reed's saddlebag. His expression darkened as he read. "This is unconscionable," he said. "Signed under duress. Fraudulent interest rates. Coerced labor. Any territorial judge will void it immediately. You are free. legally and permanently. Hazel felt something break open in her chest, not pain this time, but relief so profound it made her dizzy. They transported Reed and his men back to Crowfoot Crossing in chains. The entire town turned out to watch, silent and somber. Eli Boone, bandaged and pale, but alive, stood on Mrs. Pike's porch and raised his hand in salute as they passed. Wanblee was carried on a stretcher to Mrs. Pike's home, which she converted into a temporary hospital. Sarah tended him with the skill she had learned in the war, changing bandages, administering tinctures for pain and infection, sitting vigil through the long nights when fever threatened to take what the bullets had not. On the third day, he woke. Hazel was sitting beside him when his eyes opened. She had not left except to eat and sleep, and even then, only when Sarah forced her. "You are alive," she said unnecessarily. "Yes," he replied, his voice hoarse. "Surprised me too. You threw yourself in front of a bullet for Sarah." "For the evidence," he corrected. "Without it, everything we endured would have been meaningless." "You are a terrible liar," Hazel said softly. She took his hand. "You did it because you care about her, about us, about something other than revenge." "Perhaps," he admitted. "Your people sent word," she said. "The band. They heard what happened. Heard what? About you bringing Reed to justice, exposing the truth about Chaska's murder. They are lifting your exile. You can go home." Wanblee was silent for a long moment, looking at her with those dark eyes that saw too much. "Where is home?" he asked finally. "Your band. Your people." "I spent 6 months with them after the exile was announced," he said, "waiting for permission to leave, sleeping in their camps, but not belonging. They were kind, but I was a ghost to them. My brother was dead. The life I had known was finished. When I left, I felt relieved, like a burden lifted. And now I have been offered something different," he said. "Not the home I lost, but perhaps a new one, if I have the courage to accept it." Hazel felt her throat tighten. "What are you saying?" "I am saying," Wanblee said slowly, carefully, as if testing the weight of each word, "that I have spent 6 months wandering alone. And then I spent weeks with 2 women and a stubborn goat, running from death, fighting for something that mattered. And I did not feel alone anymore. I felt found. That is the most words I have ever heard you speak at once," Hazel said, smiling through tears. "I am learning," he replied. "You are a good teacher. So you will stay, if you will have me." "Yes," she said simply. "Yes." She leaned forward and kissed him gently, carefully, mindful of his injuries. His remaining hand came up to cup her face, and for a moment the world outside ceased to exist. When they broke apart, Sarah was standing in the doorway, smiling. "About time," she said. "I was beginning to think I would have to lock you 2 in a room together." Resolution. The trial of Captain Silas Reed took place in late summer in the Territorial Courthouse. The evidence was overwhelming, presented by Marshal Thorne himself. The ledger, the bullets matching Reed's revolver, Chaska's journal translated by a Lakota elder, brought specifically for that purpose. Testimonies from Jonah Pike, Mrs. Pike, Eli Boone, and a dozen townspeople. Even Murdoch turned witness for the prosecution in exchange for a reduced sentence detailing years of theft, murder, and fraud under Reed's command. Reed was found guilty on all counts. The sentence was death by hanging. The ring collapsed within weeks. Executive arrests spread across 3 territories. The territorial governor issued a formal apology to the Lakota bands for the treaty violations and theft of sacred artifacts. Land was returned. Reparations were paid. The fraudulent labor contract binding the Whitcomb sisters was not just voided, but publicly condemned by the Territorial Supreme Court as an example of the kind of coercive practices that would no longer be tolerated in civilized society. For the first time in their lives, Hazel and Sarah Whitcomb were free, completely legally, permanently free. They used the reward money from the recovered artifacts, $500, to purchase a small building in Crowfoot Crossing. Sarah opened a clinic on the ground floor, treating injuries and illnesses for anyone who needed help, regardless of ability to pay. Hazel opened a telegraph office on the second floor and began teaching telegraphy to young women in the evenings. Wanblay built a cabin on the ridge above town, with his own hands using techniques learned over years of survival and adapted to his limitations. The cabin had a good roof, a stone fireplace, and a view of the canyon where his brother rested. He did not return to the Lakota band. They understood. The elder who had translated Chaska's journal visited him once, bringing gifts and blessings, and told him he was always welcome, but never required to return. Some journeys, the elder said, lead us away from where we started, so we can find where we truly belong. One evening in early autumn, with the air finally cooling and the cottonwoods turning gold, Wanblay found Hazel sitting on the ridge, watching the sunset. He had been working with the town blacksmith to forge a new prosthetic more refined than the crude hook, with articulated fingers that could grip and manipulate objects with increasing dexterity. He sat beside her without speaking for a while, just sharing the silence and the view. "I have been thinking," he said finally. "Dangerous activity," she replied, smiling. "About home, about what it means. And I think it is not a place," he said. "Not land or buildings or even people we have known our whole lives. I think it is something we build, something we choose." "Profound," she said. "Where did you learn that?" "From a woman who stole money to save her sister, who ran for 2 years rather than give up, who picked a lock and stole evidence because she believed in justice even when the law did not, who drove a mule through a flood and climbed a cliff with bleeding hands and refused to let me die on that canyon floor." Hazel felt her eyes sting. "That woman sounds exhausted." "That woman sounds like someone worth staying for," Wanblay said. He took her hand. "I am asking, will you have me permanently, as whatever you will allow friend, partner, husband, if your customs require a formal declaration?" "Are you proposing to me?" Hazel asked, her heart hammering. "Yes," he said simply. "I am." "That was possibly the least romantic proposal in history," she said. "I am still learning," he replied. "You could teach me better words if you wish." "Or," she said, leaning in to kiss him, "I could just say yes. That would also work." They married in October, a simple ceremony conducted by the circuit preacher with Sarah and Mrs. Pike standing as witnesses and most of Crowfoot Crossing in attendance. Eli Boone, still scarred, but recovering, gave Hazel away in the absence of her father. Wanblay wore new buckskin that Sarah had made decorated with beadwork in Lakota patterns, mixed with European designs, a blend of both their worlds. Hazel wore a dress Mrs. Pike had sewn, simple but elegant. The goat attended and behaved itself for once. As winter approached, the three of them, Hazel, Sarah, and Wanblay, sat on the cabin's porch, watching the first snow dust the canyon rim. The goat slept at their feet, fat and content. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had not found you in that wash?" Sarah asked Wanblay. "If we had just kept riding." "Every day," he admitted. "But we did not. You stopped. You helped. You saved my life. And now we are here. Everything that came after." Hazel said, "The running, the fear, the fighting, do you think it was worth it?" Wanblay looked at her, then at Sarah, then out at the land that had tested them and nearly broken them, but ultimately made them stronger. "Yes," he said. "Every moment of it. Because it brought us here. Together." As darkness fell and the temperature dropped, they went inside to the warmth of the fire. Outside, the wind moved through the canyon, carrying the scent of snow and sage and the promise of a future they would build together. The goat followed them in stubborn and loyal to the end.